Thank you very much. Thank you. I first touched on this theme of writing stories about the history of 20th century China through the lives of women. I first touched on this theme nearly 30 years ago, or 30 years ago, indeed. Through writing Wild Swans, the stories of my grandmother, my mother, and myself, and our stories reflect the history of 20th century China. And now I've just finished another book about three women, the three sisters from Shanghai. Whereas in my family, the three women were on the receiving end of history. These three women, big sister, little sister, red sister, were right at the heart of power in 20th century China and helped make history in China in the 20th century. Now, before I get on to them, I'd like to say a few words about how I became a writer and how I came to write this book. I loved writing when I was a child, but when I was growing up in China, in the 1950s, the 60s, and the 70s, it was impossible even to dream of becoming a writer. And in those years, nearly all writers were condemned, sent to the Gulag, driven to suicide. Some were even executed. And even writing for oneself was dangerous. I remember writing my first poem on my 16th birthday in 1968. It was in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. And I was lying in bed, polishing my poem, when I heard the door banging. The Red Guards had come to raid our flat. I had to quickly rush to the bathroom to tear up my poem and flush it down the toilet. And that ended my first venture in writing. But the idea of writing never left me. In the following years, I was exiled to the edge of the Himalayas and worked as a peasant and as a barefoot doctor, and later as a steel worker and an electrician. So when I was spreading manure in the paddy fields, and when I was checking electricity supplies on top of the electricity poles, and I was always writing in my head with an imaginary pen. But I couldn't put pen to paper. Then in 1976, Mao died and China began to change. And in 1978, I became one of the first group of 14 people to come and study in Britain. And when I arrived in Britain, I could now pick up the pen, but it was at that moment the desire to write left me, because I had come to a completely different world. It was like landing on Mars. I mean, when we first came, we were all wearing the Mao suit, the blue uniform-like thing, and we were not allowed to go out on our own. We had to move in a group. So we were quite a sight in the London streets. And life was tremendous fun, of course. And I was the first one from mainland China to do many things, including to walk into an English pub. Because the Chinese translation for pub is 酒吧, which in those years suggested somewhere indecent with nude women gyrating. So we were told, you mustn't go into a pub. But I was torn with curiosity, of course. And one day I sneaked out of the college, I darted across the road, I pushed the door of the pub open, and I saw nothing of the kind. Only some men sitting there drinking beer, and I was very disappointed, of course. So everything was new. I was having a tremendous time. And to write would mean to look inward and backward into a past I wanted to forget all about. And in the Cultural Revolution, my father died, and my grandmother died, and my mother was subject to over 100 these denunciation meetings, and she was made to kneel on broken glass. She was paraded in the streets when children spat at her and threw stones at her. And I just wanted to forget all about those and just enjoy life. And so for 10 years, I didn't write. And then in 1988, my mother came to stay with me. For the first time, she told me the stories of her life and the stories of my grandmother and her relationship with my father. And once she started, my mother couldn't stop. She stayed with me for 6 months, and she talked every day. By the time she left London, she had left me 60 hours of tape recordings. And when I was listening to her, I kept saying to myself, I've got to write all this down. And then I realized how much I wanted to be a writer and how much I had always wanted to be a writer. And it also seemed to me that my mother seemed to know that I had cherished this unspoken dream. She was helping me to fulfill the dream. And because when I was out working, in fact, I was working at SOAS in those years, and my mother would talk into a tape recorder. So after my mother left, I sat down, I transcribed my mother's tape recordings, and I wrote Wild Swans. And I became a writer. And after Wild Swans, I wrote a biography of Mao with my husband, John Halliday, who's at Oxford in his time. We divided our research of 12 years by language. Because I'm Chinese, I dealt with the Chinese language sources. And John, who's half English, half Irish, unfortunately knows many languages, so he was landed with the rest of the world. And after we published Mao, the Unknown Story, I wrote a biography of Empress Dowager Cixi, the last great royal ruler of China, who brought China from a medieval society into the modern age. And she was the one who banned the foot binding, who brought modernity into China. And she was committed, before she died in 1908, to turning China into a constitutional monarchy with an elected parliament and a free press, independent legal system, the lot. Now, then I was thinking about my next book and how China traveled between 1908, when the Empress Dowager died, to 1949, when Mao seized the power. In these 40 years, China changed from a place full of hope to become more open and free into a totalitarian hell. And these 40 years fascinated me. And the three Song sisters and their husbands, Sun Yat-sen, the so-called father of China, who was the first one to promote republicanism, and Chiang Kaishek, his successor and the ruler of China before Mao threw him out of mainland China to Taiwan. Their stories are the stories of those key 40 years, and of course much longer, but mainly in those years. And so choosing to write about the three sisters answered my question, helped me to answer my question. Now, here is the stories of the sisters in 15 minutes. Now, their mother, sitting in the middle with big sister Eiling and red sister Qingling on both sides of her, came from the oldest Christian family in China, the most illustrious family in China. And a district in Shanghai today is not named after her family. Their father, Charlie Song, also had a very interesting experience. He went to America in 1878 as a coolie, an unskilled worker, but he ran away and landed in the American South, and he became the first Chinese to be converted by the Southern Methodists. He spent 7 years in the American South, received training, and went back to China as a preacher. And he later went into business and made lots of money. And with his money, what he most wanted to do was to give his children an American education. His 3 daughters as well as 3 sons. Big sister Eiling went to America in 1904, aged 14, and she was the first Chinese woman from China to go to America, to receive education in America. Her 2 sisters followed. Qingling, when she was 14, and Meiling when she was 9. And she's Meiling, little sister Meiling, spent 10 years in America. And what struck me in particular was that, you know, these girls were in America completely on their own, with no adult family members to look after them. Such was their parents' faith in American society and in the Methodist community. Qingling came back, and in 1915, she fell in love with Sun Yat-sen, here, the father of China. And she wanted to marry him, but her parents were furiously against the marriage because Sun Yat-sen had a wife and 3 children, and a concubine, and the other consorts. Basically, he was a womanizer. And not to mention that he was more than twice of her age. So their parents locked Qingling in her bedroom, but she climbed out of the window and boarded the ship to go from Shanghai to Japan and married him. She was passionately in love and wanted to sacrifice herself for him. But she was hugely let down. In 1922, the couple was surrounded by Sun Yat-sen's political enemies and some soldiers. And she volunteered to stay behind to cover his escape. So he fled. But what she didn't know was after he arrived in safety, he still didn't want her to leave. He wanted her to be there as a bait to draw enemy fire, to stir up a battle, so he could fight back from the outside for his political goals, which boiled down to becoming the president of Republican China. And she had a hellish flight, she nearly died, and she suffered a miscarriage and could never have children. And she was devastated, and she did some calculation, her heart went cold. She did some calculation, and she decided she didn't want to divorce him, but she wanted to do deals with him. The deal she most wanted was to become a public figure as Madame Sun Yat-sen, but in her own right. And here she is, standing on the platform with Sun Yat-sen in the middle. And this was the opening ceremony of the Wangpo Military Academy. Sun Yat-sen, to fulfill his goal, brought in the Russian communists. And they were the only people who were prepared to back him to overthrow the Beijing government, which was democratically elected and internationally recognized. And the Russians gave him airplanes, cannons, other arms, and founded this military academy for him. And on his right was Chiang Kaishek, and Sun Yat-sen's military chief and the head of the Wangpo Academy. Now, after Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, Chiang Kai-shek was the successor. And in 1927, he split from the communists and the Russians. And this picture, taken in 1927, was probably the last one of the three sisters together, genuinely, happily together. Because then they embraced two antagonistic political camps. Big sister Eiling, little sister Meiling were passionately anti-communists. So they were with Chiang Kai-shek. And the red sister Qingling, by then had been converted to Leninism, and she was a committed communist. Now, little sister Meiling then married Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader and the commander of the army. And then he founded the nationalist government in 1928. Now, the Chiang Kai-sheks were on their honeymoon, but their marriage went through many ups and downs. And the main reason was little sister Meiling just couldn't get used to Chiang Kai-shek's world. Chiang Kai-shek had risen in his political career by being an assassin. He bumped off Sun Yat-sen's main political rival, and that's how he caught Sun's eye and became eventually Sun's successor. And as a result, he himself was pursued by assassins, and some got into their bedroom near their marital bed. And as a result, Meiling suffered a miscarriage and could never have children. Oh, sorry, no, this. Now, Chiang Kai-shek wanted to pull his wife out of depression. Meiling was in depression for 7 years. And he wanted to pull his wife out of depression, and he gave her a birthday present in 1932. It was a necklace, but no ordinary necklace. And as you can see, it encircled a whole mountain. By the way, this is outside Nanjing. I know one of the scholars is from Nanjing, so this is right next to your home. But you know, the jewel of the necklace is a beautiful villa. It's called the Palace of Meiling. It has these green tiles on the roof, which sparkle in the sun, looking like a real jewel. And the chains of the necklace were French pine trees. And these foreign trees color in autumn in a different way from the local trees. So they stand out and making it like a real necklace. And of course, Chiang Kai-shek, you need a private plane for your wife to see her present, which they did. Big sister Eiling was the person who brought her sister and Chiang Kai-shek together. And she was Chiang Kai-shek's most important unofficial advisor. And she made a lot of money thanks to her position. She became one of the richest women in China. And part of that was thanks to her husband, H.H. Kung, who, thanks to her connection, was Chiang Kai-shek's prime minister and the finance minister for more than a decade. And meanwhile, Red Sister was in exile in Russia. Here she is in the Caucasus. And the man to her left was someone called Deng Yanda, who was a very charismatic man with leadership qualities. And Stalin wanted him to be the head of the Chinese communists. But he said, you know, I don't even believe in communism. And so he fled to Berlin, and Qingling, Red Sister, then followed him to Berlin. And the two exiles then fell in love. Now, Deng Yanda then organized a third party to be separate from the nationalists and the communists. And he became a big threat to Chiang Kaishek. In 1931, Chiang Kaishek had him murdered. And as a result, Red Sister Qingling hated Chiang Kaishek and devoted the rest of her life to bring down Chiang Kaishek, even though this meant the ruin of her family and her sisters. And the war against Japan briefly brought the sisters together, and Mei Ling, as a first lady, inspecting, you know, or visiting wounded soldiers. And she addressed US Congress in 1943. She was only the second woman to address US Congress. She had a standing ovation of 5 minutes. She had a triumphant tour in America, and here she was in 1943 with Chiang Kai-shek at Cairo conference with Roosevelt and Churchill. Now, and of course, as you can see, the sisters together with Chiang Kai-shek and Red Sister Qingling made sure she always stood apart, and she would never smile in Chiang Kai-shek's presence. Oh, there's brothers, 3 brothers, we'll skip them. Okay. Oh, it's okay. Now, Chiang Kai-shek's portrait on Tiananmen Gate, very near Mao's portrait, is today. This was after the victory of war against Japan. But then the Civil War started, and Mao beat Chiang Kai-shek. Here he was in the middle, leaving mainland China, leaving his ancestral home and mainland China for Taiwan. The man to his right with a hat on is his son, Qing Guo. And Qing Guo was Chiang Kai-shek's only blood son. And he was kept hostage in Russia by Stalin for 12 years. He was slung into the Gulag and suffered tremendously. And Chiang Kai-shek was desperate to get his son back. And as a result, he offered a deal to Stalin to trade the survival of the Chinese communists with the return of his son. And he got his son back, but he lost mainland China. And in 1975, Chiang Kai-shek died in Taiwan, and Qing Guo became the ruler of Taiwan. It was he who put Taiwan on the road to democracy, which Taiwan is today. Meanwhile, Red Sister Qingling became Mao's vice chair. Here she is, the shorter woman, and next to Mao, and on her right is the Prime Minister Zhou Enlai, and to Zhou's right was Deng Xiaoping, the paramount leader of China after Mao died. And this was Mao's Memorial Service in 1976. And Qingling is standing in the middle, the shortest, supported by a member of the staff. And you may notice the gaps. The reason was that soon after, less than a month after Mao died, his wife, Jung Chang, was arrested and together with the rest of the Gang of Four. When this memorial service took place, the Gang of Four were still there. But by the time the picture was published, the Gang of Four had gone gone to prison. And so the editors couldn't do anything but just to erase them from the picture. You may wonder what Elvis is doing here with the sisters. Now, the lady he was holding is the Hollywood star Deborah Page. Deborah was the leading lady of Elvis's first film, Love Me Tender. And Elvis proposed to her, but Deborah turned down the king to marry big sister Eiling's son. Now, this is me, wearing the same clothes. and with Deborah and Deborah's son, Gregory. Gregory today is the only descendant of the three illustrious sisters. And big little sister Mei Ling, aged about 100. She lived to see 3 centuries and died in 2003. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Jung Chang, for a fascinating talk that really sort of walks us through the many dimensions and kind of historical complexities of China in the 20th century, narrated through the lens of these 3 sisters. I mean, I have so many questions, so just to try to break it down, I think I will start kind of very simply, which is to go back to your one of your opening scenes of you writing the poem and destroying the poem. Why is it that writing is dangerous? I mean, you know, you've talked about lives that were in danger, in modern China, but what is it about the writing of those dangerous lives that is dangerous?
For a dictatorship, I mean, writing, I think it's always dangerous the world over, because when we write, I think most of us would strive to tell the truth, to find the truth and to tell the truth. And that's what the dictator was most afraid of. I mean, I know in China, the dictatorship is built on lies, historical lies. I mean, the history has been doctored by the nationalists and the communists for 100 years. I mean, so anyone who is trying to find out the truth is going to be in trouble. I myself, I'm afraid I'm condemned as a historical nihilist who blindly seek truth without guidance, of course, guidance from the party. So that's how they view how one should write. You should be guided by the party, and I'm not guided by the party, so I'm naturally regarded, or my writing is naturally regarded as a threat.
And then what is it that, and I've been planning and hoping to ask this question for weeks, what is it then about the narration of generations that gets us a bit closer to the truth, do you think? Because it can't fail to strike all of us. Jung Chang has written 2 books in which you trace 3 generations in the life of a family. And in fact, you tell history, national history, through women's stories. Could you reflect aloud a little for us what it is about those lives, those generations that allows you to hone in?
Well, the thing is, once you start with one period, you go into other period, you inevitably find that the true history, story of that period is not what the official line was. And I you know, I just didn't, it's not exactly the generation. I mean, naturally, you just go from one generation, then you find more you need to find out, and you go into the next generation. I mean, for each of my book, I try to write some of the wrong pictures of the former history books. I mean, you know, in this one, in particular, I mean, I focused on the 40 years before the communists came to power, the early Republican time, until the communists came to power. And I immediately found that, you know, it was just full of holes and full of lies. I mean, now the thing is this, I bet anyone who's studying history of China has not been told the period that China was a functioning democracy. And from the beginning of the Republican period to 1928, when Chiang Kaishek seized power, China was actually a functioning democracy. There were 3 general elections, 1913, that's every 5 years, 1913, 1918, 1923. Flawed, of course, but nevertheless, elections. And there were elected parliaments, I mean, independent legal systems struggling to be independent, and completely free press, and extreme tolerance of dissent. And all this has been swept under the carpet or under whatever by the subsequent regimes, Chiang Kai-shek's regime and Mao's regime, and even post-Mao communist regime, and simply because these regimes have learned from Leninism that the importance of propaganda and the importance of the control of history.
So, do you feel then that it is the individual story, the personal story, the story of the kinds of kind of day-to-day suffering, the loss of pregnancies, for example? I did notice that you touched on that twice in the talk. Is it those small stories then that give us a more truthful or a more personal or a more insightful view of history than the big stories of propaganda?
Yes, well, the thing is, I myself, I'm terrified of dry history lessons, if I may say. I mean, I love the stories. I love personal stories. I love the human dimension of history. And so, but I then find that if you focus on this human history, you inevitably bring out the larger picture. I mean, may I go into another story? I mean, you know, about the Cultural Revolution, during the Cultural Revolution, about when John and I were writing our biography of Mao, we traveled the world and interviewed anyone who had interesting dealings with Mao. And one of them was Imelda Marcos, the Filipino former first lady who had thousands of pairs of shoes. And she had a flirtatious relationship with Mao. And when she saw Mao, she wore these glorious clothes. And Mao then was obviously in rapture and picked up her hand and kissed it. And when I saw it, when I was in China in the Cultural Revolution, when anyone else who did this would have been condemned as indulging in bourgeois habits and being subject to denunciation meetings. And so I was astonished. But then, of course, Madame Mao was also astonished and became very jealous because she, too, could only wear these Mao uniforms, very unbecoming. So she then tried to design a national uniform for Chinese women. Her design was lousy, but that's another story. But as a result, I was able to wear my first skirt in 10 years. And I remember the thrill in 1975 when I wore my skirt. And since the beginning of the Cultural Revolution in 1966. So as a grown-up woman, this was my first time to wear a skirt. And and I feel that's a personal story, but it brings alive a picture of China then.
It's also a
Oh,
woman.
by the way, sorry,
Sorry, yes, go ahead.
Imelda then batted her eyes furiously at Jung, my Jung, and she said, oh, Western men simply don't understand us Eastern women. And Jung said, have you come across any Western men who understand you? And she said, only one person, Richard Nixon.
You've been entertaining us with stories of dress and of fashion and of design. These tend to be conventionally kind of, women's stories. And it can't fail to strike us that you have told us about a story of three sisters. Your own story, Wild Swans, is about three women in three generations of a Chinese family. Just before we open to the floor, Jung, is there something about women's stories that's interesting to reflect on in this respect?
Yes, I mean, I think writing about women is, let's say, I mean, Mao, of course, was fascinating. It was one story. But writing about women in general is much more to my taste. I love it. I think because there are so many dimensions you could write about. In fact, after the Empress Dowager biography, I had first wanted to write about Sun Yat-sen because I wanted to write about another program setter, like Cixi, the Empress Dowager, and Mao. And Sun Yat-sen was the man most responsible for these years of the transition between Cixi to Mao. And I had wanted to write about him. And I gathered a lot of materials, and I started writing, and then I just got bored. And because, I mean, here is a man who was single-mindedly pursuing his political goals and at the cost of everything. I mean, Mao was like that. I'd written about Mao, so I didn't feel that I wanted to devote a book to another sort of a small Mao. But in the meantime, his wife and her sisters emerged as far more interesting figures. There are far more stories I love, and equally dramatic, equally telling, but very interesting. So and also the miscarriages of the two sisters you mentioned are connected with the husbands they chose and with the history of China, so to speak. So I find that very interesting. And the Empress Dowager also was a fascinating figure. And apart from ruling China for nearly half a century, on and off, but mainly on, and brought China into the modern age. And she was a landscape designer. She loved operas. She revived Chinese operas. And in many dimensions, she fell in love with a eunuch at a time, when eunuchs were absolutely treated like worms. And she had and many dimensions, which made a difference to Chinese history. And so I just find it more interesting for me.
Well, on that note of many dimensions, let's open for some questions. I think what I'll do is I'll take questions in pairs, maybe. I see a hand over there, and I see a hand over there, and a hand over here. So maybe three, actually, as I see three hands. Yes, please. Yes. Sorry, could you just wait for the mic? I'm sorry, so everyone can hear.
So thank you for your presentation. It is very good. So when we talk about personal stories, one question I have is usually we focus on stories of those powerful people and those people surrounding the powerful leaders during the history, but we didn't talk too much about ordinary people, so how very ordinary people live their lives through the history and also the contemporary China. We know there are very diverse group of people in China now. They are trying to live a good livelihood. And, but the media and many authors, they try to focus on the leaders and the central government. And I think about these ways of writing could possibly lose some kind of nuance and lose the full picture of the societies. So how do you think about we can account for this issue, and what do you think the impact of this style of writing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as I say, I'm going to cluster questions. We'll keep those in our minds. Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Paul Cadario, Ontario and Maudlin, 1973. I had the privilege of working on China for the World Bank around the, from 87 to 93. And so I'm just going to, my question is very much in the vein of the previous speaker. You have told a story of 3 women whose relationship, to use the modern vernacular, would be, wealth and power through their husbands. And it's a fascinating story, and I look forward to reading your book, which is brand new. If we were to, or if you were to look at a story of 3 women, and the pivotal point was Tiananmen, 1989, sort of looking at what led their lives before, their lives after, as you, I think, have briefly described this morning, what would that narrative look like? Or how would you approach it, perhaps differently from the way you approached Big Sister, Little Sister, Red Sister?
Okay, thank you very much. And then there was a question here, please.
Thank you so much for the narrative. And I think my question is about how to construct this narrative, because you just mentioned about the functioning democracy, which lives in a short period in Chinese history. But like in our dry history book, we learned that, for example, somebody would say there is still a huge problem of the dukes, the local dukes, and making this parliament to be highly superficial, and it's just it's just ineffective, and just a prima facie kind of democracy. So I guess my essential question is, so how to select these materials and to construct an unbiased and objective narrative.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Shall I start? Shall I? Okay. Now, first of all, about writing about ordinary women. My first book, Wild Swans, is about my grandmother, my mother, and myself. We are ordinary women. We are not in making policies. So that book is about ordinary people. And of course, we were privileged. My parents were in a communist elite. But the book, both that book and the Three Sisters book, are also full of characters like school teachers, doctors, and peasants, workers, my fellow workers when I was an electrician. I had electric shocks in the first month, and how that I was, being given help by these other electricians. So it's about them as well. About Tiananmen, now I don't feel I'm qualified to write about that because I write about history with distance. Like Tiananmen, and also I feel I've got to have lived through that. And B, I should have masses of documents. And the documents are cut off now. So it's impossible to even research. And I wasn't in China, so I didn't have that acute feeling. I left in 1978, and China really began to open up in the 80s. Now, yes, exactly. How do we select materials? I had no idea China was a democracy from 1912 to 1928. But I was trying to see what was happening in that period. Now, first of all, what is the Chinese government at the time? Who is the Chinese government? And how did the Chinese government come about? And that's how a can of worms was opened. And I realized that in the history, the government, we were given the impression somehow Sun Yat-sen's Canton government was the government. And if you've come from that perspective, you, of course, you think the Beijing government was terrible, illegitimate, and Sun Yat-sen's was legitimate. And then, but I realized, actually I spent a lot of time on this because writing every book is a discovery for me. And I realized there was this Beijing government. I mean, yes, there were various kingmakers trying to exert influence, but ultimately that government was elected. I mean, I traced the election process in this book. I mean, you can also see the notes and other people's study of this period. And 1913, the general election, and how in the Empress Dowager's book, and she'd already laid the ground for elections, starting from the election of provincial parliaments, the 资政局, and that election took place in 1909, soon after she died. And then everything was done according to a program set at her time. And then in 1913, the general election took place. And then, you know, I must say, to unravel, to get really, to unravel the truth and to cut across all these layers of myth created by decades of propaganda is not easy. And I very much think Oxford should have people study this period, you know, exactly what happened in the 20 years after the Republic was founded. And so there were these list of parliamentary members. I mean, their names, the exact names, their professions. I mean, at the time, the US, for example, the UK had sent observers to observe these elections. And so on. And so, I mean, my book is only the beginning. I hope it will trigger interest in this period and see how China was functioning as a democracy. Yes, the government was messy. It's messy in every democracy. It's messy in Britain today. I mean, it's but nevertheless, let's look at all the other indexes of a democracy. And China was right there as a genuine, flawed democracy.
Thanks very much. Okay, I'm going to cluster another sort of 3 set of questions. I see hands all around the room. I don't want to favoritize that side of the room over this side. So if there are any questions here, thank you. And the gentleman over there in the front row, and then a hand over there at the back. Yes, thank you. So here and there and then here. Thank you.
Hello, so my name's Amy. I'm the Rhodes Scholar from Hong Kong and Beijing in 1997. I wanted to ask about language. So you grew up in China and Chinese is your first language, but what is it like writing in English? Is it liberating or constricting? Because I'm a playwright and I'm also writing in English, but I feel like there are compromises I have to make, and there's also like opportunities writing in a different language.
Okay. Yes.
Sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm clustering.
Right. No.
The question over there. Yes, please. Yes. Fatima, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a fascinating presentation. I'm sure I speak for everybody. We're going to run over to Blackwell's and see if we can get this as soon as possible. I just wanted to make the theme of the presentation explicit. What do you unearth as a historian when you discenter the stories of men and institutions dominated by men from crafting a history or a political history? What is it that you feel like you have unearthed that the various histories that are centered on the experiences of men tend to miss out on?
Interesting.
What's that? Sorry.
Did you what is it to grapple with the history of men and institutions led by men? What kinds of challenges there?
Yeah. And then this gentleman.
Thank you very much for what you've done and the way that you've told personal stories to give us a bit more on the big story about China. I mean, obviously, we're trying to come to grips with China now as a superpower and where's it going and what are its motives. But one period you haven't mentioned, so would be the period in the 19th century with the Opium Wars and the humiliation of China, which many would say it's now payback time. I mean, how important was that national humiliation still working through in the psyche of China's attitude to the rest of the world, and particularly the West?
Okay, I'll answer from your question first and then to yours at last. Now, I think my Empress Dowager, the Cixi book, indirectly answered the question. I mean, she was of course a child when the Opium War started, but basically she was in power when China was suffering the result of the Opium War. I mean, in the book, I mean, this is not place to get into it, but I mean, the fact is China was never colonized. I mean, it was never a colony, and it was never subjected to the fate of the other colonies. I mean, it depends on what you think by humiliation. I mean, yes, indeed. I mean, you know, the Summer Palace was burned, and which hurt her very, very much, the old Summer Palace, which was why she tried so hard to have it rebuilt and eventually built the new Summer Palace today, for which she was wrongly condemned. But in fact, you know, in my book, I documented how she got the money. She had to steal a bit here and, you know, claw out a bit of funds there. I mean, that is, there are these things, but it's, that's, okay, I'll leave you to have a look at that book if you really feel, and to see how much that experience could and should affect today's approach to the West. Now, the other question is about the men. And of course, in a sense, why I wanted to write about the women, because history has always been, in China, has always been written by men. I mean, here again, the role of the Empress Dowager, my previous book. I mean, she was such an important figure. I mean, just one thing, she banned foot binding, and for which, you know, Chinese women, and including my grandmother, were tormented for over 1,000 years. But it was always credited to men. I mean, all her policies, her opening up China and so on, they were all credited to the men around her. And then I was thinking, you know, who is making decisions in those years? Who is making decisions? I mean, these men were not, that usually got the credit, were not even at the central power. And then I had to read all the imperial decrees. I mean, there are, you can fill half the room. I mean, the imperial decrees and so on. And then I found out it was she made all the decisions. And it was hugely unfair to her. And she'd been maligned for over 100 years and so on. Okay, the last question is writing in English. Of course, it's not easy. I mean, I started learning English when I was 21. And the first before I came to Britain in 1978, the only foreigners I spoke to were some foreign sailors in a port in South China, where my classmates and I were sent to practice our English with. And we were so keen to talk to them because China in those days were completely closed to the outside world. As far as we were concerned, these sailors were our only hope, and we were only there for 2 weeks. So we would be sitting in a sailors' club, International Sailors' Club, eagerly awaiting our sailors. And we would grab them as soon as they came on shore. And of course, we had no idea what must be on their minds. But it's not impossible. So I write my books in English. I mean, my husband, John Halliday, helped me, particularly with Wild Swans. and we wrote the Mao biography together. So it's not, I can only say it's not impossible. And I'm also particularly pleased that with my background of this little contact with outside world, I could write these 3 biographies in a way that's my trilogy about the history and major personalities of modern China. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The spontaneous applause said it all, really. I mean, as you've gathered, we're out of time, and I'm going to close the session, but perhaps we could show our appreciation one more time. I think what Jung Chang has so very powerfully, eloquently demonstrated is the analytic but also emotional power of stories and telling history from below. So thank you so much, Jung. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.